Get out! The word didn't come out loud. It came out like something dragged from the bottom of a man who had stopped caring whether anyone heard him. The glass hit the wall. Not at her, but close enough. Close enough to mean something. She left. They always left. And then the room went quiet. The kind of quiet that has a sound of its own. A hum, a pressure, a weight sitting on the chest of a man who hadn't left this floor of the mansion in 8 months. He wheeled himself to the window. San Francisco glittered below him. A city full of people moving, living, choosing. He watched it the way a man watches a world he no longer belongs to. Then he heard it. A laugh. Soft, familiar. Coming from nowhere. And everywhere. Gia. His jaw tightened. His knuckles went white on the armrests. It should have been me, he whispered into the glass. Into the silence. Into the guilt that had become the only thing keeping him company. The room didn't answer. It never did. Until she walked in and refused to leave. Before we go any further, do you think she was going to do something different or leave just like every other person? Drop your answer in the comments right now. I want to know what you were thinking. And while you're down there, tell me where in the world you're watching from. Seriously, every time I read these comments, it blows my mind. Someone's watching from Nairobi. Someone's watching from Seoul. Someone's watching from their bed in Toronto at 2 a.m., pretending they were going to sleep an hour ago. I see you. Oh, and real quick, how is your day going? Because if it's been anything less than wonderful, this story is about to do something about that, I promise. One more thing before we continue. Hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Because tomorrow's story, it involves a secret, a midnight confession, and a decision that will absolutely ruin you in the best way. You do not want to miss it. New romance drops here every single day. All right. Now, let's go back to San Francisco, because on the other side of the city, someone was about to make a decision that would change both their lives forever. Her name was Zola, and she was walking away from a job she desperately needed. The office was clean, corporate, the kind of place where the lighting made everything look slightly more acceptable than it was. Her interviewer had smiled too much and said too little until the very end. When his meaning became clear in the way certain meanings always become clear, not in the words, in the spaces between them. We'd need you available, fully available, evenings, weekends, flexibility. The way he said it, the way his eyes moved when he said it. Zola had stood up slowly, smoothed her blazer, and said with a voice as calm and as final as still water, "Thank you for your time," and walked out. She waited until she was half a block away before she let out the breath she'd been holding. The San Francisco wind hit her face sharp, alive, cutting. She stood on the sidewalk and let it. She needed that job. She needed it the way people need air. Not because she wanted to, but because the rent was due in 11 days, her sister Temmie's school fees were overdue, and the refrigerator at home was doing that quiet, apologetic hum that meant it was thinking about giving up. But Zola had a rule, built over years, simple. She would not compromise herself for survival. Not today, not ever. She rode the bus home with her interview bag on her lap and her eyes on the window, watched the city slide past. The hills, the color-stacked houses, the bay flashing silver through the gaps in the buildings. Thought about her parents, the accident that took them both 3 years ago, leaving her at 24 with a 17-year-old sister, a grief she hadn't finished processing, and bills that hadn't cared about either. She thought about Temmie. That was usually enough to keep her moving. The apartment was small, the kind of small that required creativity, where the dining table was also a desk and the living room was also a study hall. But it was theirs, and Temmie was at it when Zola walked in, textbooks spread wide, highlighter in hand, headphones draped around her neck. She looked up. "How'd it go?" Zola smiled. Wide, easy, the kind of smile that takes years of practice. "Something better is coming," she said. Temmie held her gaze for a second. She was 17, not 7, she could read a room. then nodded slowly and went back to her books. She trusted Zola the way people trust the only solid thing in their world. She didn't need it explained. She just needed it to be true. Zola went to the kitchen, opened the fridge, closed it, sat at the counter with her phone in her hand. That's when the notification arrived. A message from a private recruitment agency she'd applied 2 weeks ago and half forgotten. 4 lines, clean. Immediate placement available. Live-in caregiver position, Pacific Heights, high compensation, non-negotiable start date this Monday. She read it twice. Pacific Heights, old money, the kind of address that came with expectations. And with risk. She typed, "Can you tell me more about the client?" The reply came back in under a minute. Kang Hyun Woo, CEO, Kang Global. Wheelchair-bound following an accident 8 months ago. Emotionally difficult. Previous caregivers were unable to continue. She stared at the screen. Previous caregivers were unable to continue. She thought about the rent. She thought about Temmie's school fees. She thought about the refrigerator's quiet, dying hum. She exhaled slowly and typed back, "I'll take it." The mansion on Broadway Street did not look like a place where someone was choosing not to live. It looked like the opposite. Glass and stone, clean, severe lines. The kind of architecture that announces power without needing to raise its voice. Behind it, San Francisco stretched all the way to the bay. The bridge, the hills, the pale gold of a late afternoon sky. Zola stood at the entrance with her bag and made herself breathe evenly. The door opened before she knocked. A woman, 60s, precise posture. The kind of face that had once been beautiful and had decided somewhere along the way to become formidable instead. She looked Zola over. Not unkindly, but with the efficiency of someone who had been disappointed before and was managing her expectations carefully. "You're the new one," she said. Not a question. "I am, Zola Mensa." The woman nodded once. "I'm his mother." She stepped aside. "Come." The interior was immaculate, expensive, and, somehow, empty. Not of furniture, but of warmth, like a beautiful space that someone had stopped living in and hadn't noticed. His mother led her through the hallway, speaking in a low, even voice. Not cruel, just honest. The voice of a woman who had run out of softness and was now operating on the harder currency of truth. "He has not left this floor in 8 months. He refuses therapy. He barely eats. He has driven away everyone who has tried to help him." A pause. "He doesn't want to live. I need you to understand that before you meet him." Zola let that land. "I understand," she said. His mother stopped at the door at the end of the hall, looked at her. "Do you?" she said, and opened it. He was at the window. Wheelchair angled toward the glass, back to the room, the way a person positions themselves when they want to make clear they are not receiving visitors. He didn't turn when they entered. "I told you no more caregivers," he said. His English was precise, slightly accented, each word placed like it had been selected deliberately. "And I told you," his mother replied, "that I will not watch you disappear." Silence. Then he turned. And Zola had 1 second. Just one. To take in the full weight of what she was looking at. Younger than she'd expected. 34, maybe 35. Jawline sharp enough to cut glass. Eyes that had probably once made boardrooms go very quiet. But which now held a darkness that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with something else entirely. Something hollow. Those eyes moved to her. She held his gaze. He picked up the glass from the side table and in one clean, deliberate motion, hurled it, not at her, past her. It shattered against the wall to her left. "I don't need help," he said. Flat, final. The room went still. His mother's hand moved slightly. A reflex, an apology. Zola didn't flinch. She walked to the shelf along the wall, picked up the small dustpan and brush she'd already spotted when she walked in, the kind of detail you notice when you've been paying close attention to rooms your whole life. and she began cleaning up the glass. Slowly, methodically, without a word. He watched her. She could feel it. His stare sharp and confused, like a man who had prepared for a reaction she simply wasn't giving him. She finished, set the dustpan down, straightened, turned to face him. "I'm Zola," she said. "I'll be back tomorrow at 7. She picked up her bag and walked to the door. Behind her, silence. Then very quietly. So quietly, she almost missed it. "Why are you still here?" She paused at the doorway, didn't turn around. "I just told you," she said. "I'll be back tomorrow." And she left. He didn't sleep that night. He never really slept anymore. He existed in the space between sleep and wakefulness. Suspended, unresolved, like the night of the accident had pressed pause on something inside him that hadn't found a way to resume. The memory came the way it always came, when the apartment was dark and the city had gone quiet. He was 33, driving. The car was his, the black Mercedes, fast, the kind of car that felt like control when everything else didn't. Gia was in the passenger seat, 22 years old, laughing about something, the way she was always laughing. Like the world was a private joke only she was fully in on. They'd been at the game house. She'd beaten him at every single game as she always did, and had rubbed it in with great enthusiasm, as she always did. On the drive back, they argued about something small. It was always something small. She said something sharp. He said something sharper. She went quiet, looked out the window, and he, irritated, proud, too stubborn to soften first, drove faster, the way men drive when they want the speed to say what they won't. The truck came from the left. He saw the headlights. He turned the wheel. Too late. The impact. Then, hospital lights. White, relentless. His mother's face above him, crumpled in a way he had never seen it before and would never unsee. A doctor's voice somewhere, the smell of antiseptic and the sound of monitors, and the particular terrible quiet of a room where the news has already been delivered. Gia didn't make it. He woke up 2 days later, his legs no longer responding, a grief so large it had no shape, no edges, no place to put it. The doctors said the paralysis might be partial, emotional, treatable. That with therapy, with time, with sustained effort. He stopped listening after might be. Because here was the truth he had never said to anyone. He wasn't trying to recover. That was a choice. Deliberate, conscious, daily. To refuse the therapy, refuse the exercises, refuse the path back to the life he'd had before. Because the life he'd had before included Gia. And without her in it, that life was not something he was interested in returning to. To live would feel like moving on. And moving on felt like forgetting her. He couldn't. He wouldn't. Back in the present, the room was dark except for the pale, ambient light of the city through the glass. He sat with the photograph in his lap, the one of Gia in the game house, arms wide, midair, grinning like she knew something everyone else had missed. Then he heard footsteps in the hallway. Early, 6:45. Zola. On the phone, voice low and careful, the way people speak when they don't want to wake a sleeping house. "I'll figure it out, Temmie. Stop worrying about me." A pause. Then something softer. I know. Go study." He sat very still. Then, in the silence after she hung up, his own voice, low, barely a breath, not meant for anyone. "I don't deserve to live." He hadn't meant for anyone to hear it. But the walls in this house had never been quite thick enough. She heard it. She stood in the hallway for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to understand what she'd heard, long enough to feel the weight of it settle into her chest. Then she walked in. He looked up, startled, and immediately furious that he was startled. "I told you 7 o'clock. "I heard what you said." The room went quiet. He stared at her. She stared back. There was no pity in her face, That was what threw him. He'd seen pity so many times in the past 8 months that he'd learned to read it in the first 2 seconds of eye contact. The particular softness, the head tilt, the voice dropping half an octave, the carefully managed expression of a person who has decided you are fragile and is now moving through your space accordingly. None of that. Her face was still. Her eyes were direct. "Then why are you still here?" he said, low, pointed. She sat down in the chair across from him, uninvited, with the calm of someone who had decided, before walking into this room, exactly how she was going to handle this moment. "I'm asking you the same question," she said. He blinked. "If you don't deserve to live," she continued slowly, "then why are you still here? You're a billionaire. You have access, means, options, and yet," she looked at him, 8 months later, "here you are, in this room, still breathing." A pause. "That means something. It means some part of you isn't done yet." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. His jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about me." "No," she agreed. "Not yet." He looked away. Out the window, the city was beginning to light up. The slow gold of a San Francisco morning spreading across the glass, unhurried. "I don't want your routine," he said. "I don't want your structure. I don't want—" "Breakfast," she said and stood up. "I'll have it ready in 20 minutes. I said, "Eggs or congee?" He stopped. She waited. "Congee," he said finally. The word came out like a surrender he hadn't meant to make. She nodded and went to the kitchen. He sat in the quiet she left behind, looked at the space where she'd been sitting, then down at his hands on the armrests. Something had shifted. He couldn't name it. He didn't want to name it. But that evening, when she brought his dinner and left without hovering, without asking how he was feeling, without the performance of concern that everyone else offered him like a currency he'd never asked for, he ate it. All of it. And when she came to collect the tray, he looked up at her. The question came out before he'd decided to ask it. "Why do you care?" She paused at the door. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'm going to figure it out." And she left him with that. It happened slowly. The way most real things happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. The morning she arrived at exactly 7. The evening she stayed 10 minutes past her shift without either of them acknowledging it. The way she learned without being taught which silences to sit inside and which ones to gently fill. He was not easy. He snapped at her on Tuesday, ignored her completely on Thursday. On Friday, he told her flatly that she was wasting her time, her energy, and her career on someone who actively refused to be helped, and that she should consider finding a better use for all three. She made his lunch, set it in front of him, said nothing. The congee was perfect. He ate it. By the second week, something imperceptible had changed. Not in what they said. They still said very little, but in the texture of the silence between them. It was less sharp, less armed, less like a standoff and more like two people learning to occupy the same space without it being a fight. One evening, he was at the window again, the city below them, the bay glittering in the distance, shifting from silver to gray as the light fell. She was across the room, writing something. Always working, always quietly managing the invisible machinery of a life with too many moving parts. And he said, without turning, "My sister used to call San Francisco the city that can't make up its mind." Zola went still. "Because of the weather," he continued. Quiet, careful, like he was handling something that might break if he moved too fast. Fog in the morning, sun by noon, cold again by evening. A pause. She thought it was funny. She thought most things were funny. Zola said nothing for a moment. Then, "What was her name?" "Gia." She let that sit. "She sounds like someone worth missing," Zola said gently. He turned his wheelchair slightly toward the room. Not all the way. Just enough. "She was," he said. The silence that followed was different from all the others. It had texture, something almost like warmth, the kind you didn't want to break too quickly. And then Zola set her notebook down and sat on the edge of the couch near the window. Not across from him, the way she sat during confrontations, but beside, parallel, both of them looking at the city. The same direction. The same view. "My parents died 3 years ago," she said. He went still. "Car accident, both of them, same night." She looked at her hands. "I was 24. Temi was 17. The hospital counselor sat us down in a small room and gave us a pamphlet about grief resources. And I remember thinking," a pause, "I don't have time for grief because Temi still needed dinner." Something moved across his face. A flicker. Recognition. The particular recognition of someone who has lived inside a grief so enormous it reorganized everything else around it. "So I kept going," she said. "Not because I was strong. I didn't feel strong. I felt like I was standing in water that kept getting deeper, and I was just refusing to stop swimming." She looked out at the city. "I didn't get a choice, but I chose to stay." The bay glittered below them. Neither of them spoke. Then he said quietly, "I had a choice." Low, rough at the edges. "That's the difference between us." "Yes," she said. Not gently, not cruelly, simply. "You did." He looked at her then. Really looked. The way he hadn't let himself look at anyone in 8 months. And what he found in her face was not judgment, not pity, not the performance of understanding. Something harder to handle than any of those. Actual understanding. He looked back out the window. The city had gone deep blue. The bridge lights reflected off the water in long, broken lines. "Stay a little longer," he said, quietly. "Tonight." She didn't make a thing of it, didn't smile too wide, didn't say, of course, in the voice people use when they want credit for their generosity. She just stayed. They sat there as San Francisco went dark below them, and for the first time in 8 months, the silence in this room felt less like a tomb. It felt like the first careful, tentative breath of something that hadn't existed yesterday. No one could have told you exactly when it started. Not the day. Not even the week. It was more like watching the tide come in. You turn away for a moment, and when you look back, the shoreline is different. She brought him outside for the first time on a Wednesday. Just the terrace, 40 feet of stone and open sky above the city. She wheeled him through the glass doors without asking permission and parked him at the railing where the wind came in from the bay in slow, cold waves. He didn't speak, but he didn't tell her to go back inside either. The view was extraordinary, the kind of thing people paid extraordinary amounts to see and then stopped seeing because they'd seen it too many times. But he looked at it that morning as if it was the first time. Maybe because it was. Maybe because the last 8 months had been spent facing entirely inward, and outward was still new. She brought tea, set his beside him, stood a few steps away with her own, looking out at the bridge. "Temi wants to be an architect," she said eventually. Not exactly to him, just out loud. The way she sometimes spoke when she wasn't asking for anything in return. "She draws buildings in the margins of her notebooks. Drives her teachers absolutely crazy." He glanced at her. "She sounds like she knows what she wants," he said. "Always has." A small smile. "Even at 8 years old, she'd look at a building and tell you everything that was wrong with it. What she'd do differently." A pause. "My parents used to call her the CEO of her own universe." Something moved across his face at the word parents. A flicker of shared weight, acknowledged briefly without words. Then gone. "Gia wanted to be a musician," he said, quietly, testing the weight of the sentence. Whether he could carry it out loud without it breaking him. "Piano. She was actually good. Our mother wanted her to study business. They argued about it constantly." He stopped. "She never got to choose," he said. Zola didn't rush to fill that silence. She let it exist the way important things need to exist, without being hurried through or smoothed over. After a while, Did she ever play for you? All the time, mostly to show off. A pause, and then the corner of his mouth moved. Just slightly. An almost smile, fighting against years of practiced stillness. Brief, unguarded. The kind of expression a person makes when a memory arrives before the defenses do. She caught it. She didn't comment on it, but she filed it away. The days that followed had a new rhythm. Morning tea on the terrace, lunch inside. He ate more now, though he'd never in 1,000 years describe it as intentional. Afternoon quiet, music in the evenings. She put on playlists while she worked, and he never once told her to turn them off. One afternoon she played something old and soft, a piano piece, instrumental, the kind that moved through a room the way light moves through water. Slow, diffused, filling every corner. He recognized it immediately. His hands resting on the armrests went very still. She was across the room and looked up when the quality of the silence changed. Should I change it? He shook his head. Just barely. She looked at him for a moment, then back down at her notebook. She didn't know that Gia used to play that exact piece. She didn't know that the last time he'd heard it, his sister's hands had been on the keys, and her head had been bent in concentration, and he had been in the doorway, watching her, thinking he had all the time in the world. But she saw his jaw tighten, saw the way he swallowed, slow and deliberate, and she understood that something old and private was happening inside him, and that the right thing, the only right thing, was to let it happen without reaching in. When the song ended, the room held the silence for a long time. Then, she used to play that. I know, Zola said softly. He looked at her. How? Your mother told me. A pause. She wanted me to know what mattered to you. Even the things you wouldn't say yourself. He looked away. But when he turned back to the window, the darkness in his eyes had shifted. Just fractionally. Just the smallest, thinnest crack. Like a wall that has been solid for a long time, and something has finally found the first thin line to come through. That night, alone in the room, he tried to move his legs. He sat in the chair, he closed his eyes, he focused everything. Every ounce of will, of fury, of grief. Downward, into his legs, into the joints and nerves that had not responded in 8 months. His left foot moved. Just slightly, a tremor, a suggestion. He stared at it. He didn't call anyone, didn't say a word, but he tried again, and again, and again, until the room was dark and his hands were shaking from the effort, and his chest was heaving, and the city outside had gone entirely to sleep. Then he sat back. And for the first time in a very long time, one single thought moved through the dark of his mind. Quiet, tentative, barely daring to form. Maybe. She found out because she arrived early. 6:30. She came through the kitchen entrance and heard, before she saw anything, a sound from his room she had never heard in all the weeks she'd been here. The sound of effort. She pushed the door open quietly. He was on the floor. Not collapsed, not in danger, but deliberately on the floor beside his wheelchair, both hands gripping the chair's frame, pushing, trying to lift himself, his arms shaking, his jaw set in the way of a man who has decided that falling is not going to be the conclusion of this particular attempt. He heard her, looked up. Their eyes met. The expression on his face was not embarrassment. It was something more complicated. The look of a man caught in the middle of deciding to live, not yet sure he is allowed to be seen doing it. She didn't rush in, didn't gasp, didn't turn it into a rescue. She set her bag down by the door, walked in calmly, and sat cross-legged on the floor 2 feet away from him. At eye level, equal. What are you trying to do? She asked simply. Get up, he said, through his teeth. Okay, she said, so get up. His eyes narrowed. That's not. Do you want help? A long pause, wrestled with, the kind of silence where a very proud man is having a very private argument with himself. Yes, he said. Like pulling something loose that had been lodged a long time. She positioned herself beside him. Not in front, not hovering above, but beside. And they worked together until he was back in the chair. No fanfare, no speeches. Just the mechanics of two people solving a problem at close range. When he was settled, breathing hard, staring at the window, she said, "You should start therapy again." "I know," he said. She waited. "I'll call them," he said. And he did. The physical therapy sessions were brutal in the way that real recovery is brutal. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but grinding, repeated, unglamorous. The therapist, Dr. Lim, was a compact, exacting man with the patience of a mountain and zero interest in accepting sharp remarks as a substitute for effort. Zola came to every session. She sat in the corner of the room with her notebook open, always working, but present, a point of stillness in a room full of effort and frustration and the occasional sharp sound of a man who had not yet learned to fall gracefully. He fell on a Thursday. Hard, his knee gave on the parallel bars and he went down into the mat, and the sound of it filled the room, and for 1 second everything stopped. He lay on his back looking at the ceiling. Dr. Lim waited. Zola looked up from her notebook. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just looked at him. Steady, unhurried, without alarm, and her face said what her voice didn't. "I know who you are. I know you're not done." He sat up. He did it again. The night after the third week of therapy, a Friday, the city going orange outside the windows. He wheeled himself to where she was sitting. She looked up. He stopped beside her. His hand moved. Slowly, with the particular deliberateness of someone who has thought very carefully about whether they are allowed to do this, and it found hers resting open on the cushion beside her. He said nothing. She looked down at his hand over hers, then up at him. He was watching her with the expression of a man who has spent 8 months being angry at being alive, and who is, for the first time, no longer entirely certain that he is. She turned her hand over slowly, so that her palm met his. He exhaled. One long breath, the kind that carries everything inside it, the kind that has been held for so long the body doesn't quite know what to do when it finally releases. They sat like that as the city went from orange to deep blue, neither of them speaking, because some things are too large for words, and they both understood it. Later, much later, when the room had gone quiet and the city was deep in its night sounds, he reached for her again, differently this time, his hand at the edge of her face, just barely. Fingertips, hesitant in the specific way that honest things are always hesitant. Not from lack of feeling, but from the weight of it. She went still. He leaned forward, slowly, carefully, fully conscious of every inch of the space between them, and pressed his lips to hers, soft, barely there. Not the kind of kiss that is about desire, something older than that, something about reaching, across all the silence, across all the damage, across all the months of deliberate choosing not to, and deciding finally that this person is worth the risk of beginning again. She didn't pull away. When he drew back, his eyes were open, watching her face. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up, very gently, and touched the side of his face with the back of her hand. "Hyun-woo," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I know I can't ask you for—" "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He looked at her, the darkness behind his eyes. That particular, settled darkness he'd carried for 8 months. Shifted, just slightly, something behind it catching light for the very first time. "I want to stand," he said, low, rough. "When I'm with you, I want to be able to stand." She held his gaze. She didn't speak, but she nodded. And that was enough. The seasons changed. San Francisco didn't do seasons the way other cities did. No sharp lines, no dramatic shift from one world to another. It was subtler. A change in the quality of the light, the fog arriving later in the mornings, the bay shifting from gray to silver to something that was almost warm. Hyun-woo noticed it now. He hadn't before. When you've made the decision not to be in the world becomes scenery. Something happening outside of a window behind glass, not for you. But somewhere in the weeks and months after that Friday night, he had begun, slowly without announcing it, to let the world back in. Small things first. He asked his mother to move Jia's piano to the living room. He called his executive assistant for the first time in 7 months. Not to return to the office. Not yet. But to ask what had happened to an idea Jia had mentioned months before the accident. A music scholarship for young women without resources who wanted to study. She'd talked about it over dinner once, and he'd half listened, distracted, certain there would be more dinners, more time, more chances to pay proper attention. He did not dismiss it now. He began building it instead. He ate, he slept. He showed up to therapy 3 times a week with the ferocity of a man who has been given a reason and intends to use it. Dr. Lim noticed. "Whatever changed," he said one afternoon, wiping his hands on a towel. "Keep it." Hyunwoo said nothing. But that evening, on the terrace while the city lit itself gold below them, and Zola sat beside him with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, he told her. "I was ready to give up," he said. The city hummed softly. The bridge lights came on in the distance, one by one. "I'd made up my mind. I was going to disappear in that room until there wasn't anything left to disappear." A pause. "And then you walked in and cleaned up a glass and told me you'd be back at 7. He glanced at her. And at the edge of his mouth, that almost smile, more visible now than it used to be. "I didn't know what to do with that." She was quiet for a moment. "Why me?" she asked. Not fishing, genuinely needing to understand it. He thought about it seriously. "You didn't look at me like I was something to be fixed," he said finally. "You looked at me like I was something that needed to remember it was worth fixing itself." She looked down at her tea. Her eyes were bright. She was someone who had learned, through necessity, to hold her emotions at a certain distance from her face. But in this moment, the distance was shorter than usual. "You have to do this for yourself too," she said quietly. "Not for me, not to stand in front of me, or to prove something to me, or because I'm here." She looked up at him. "I need you to want to live because you want to live." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "Do you?" A pause. The honest kind. "I'm getting there," he said. And the thing was, she believed him. She studied his face for a moment. Then something in her shoulders released, and she nodded slowly, and they stayed until the city was fully dark. The next morning at therapy, Kang Hyunwoo stood. Not for long, not perfectly. His legs shook from the effort, and Dr. Lim was right there, and it lasted perhaps 12 seconds before his knees gave, and he had to sit back down, hands white-knuckled on the parallel bars. But he stood. He stood. Dr. Lim said nothing for a moment. A man who had seen this room produce every kind of moment. He let this one breathe. Then, again. And Hyunwoo looked at him, and went again. Time passed. This is the thing about healing. The real kind, not the kind that resolves in a single scene, but the actual, difficult, inch-by-inch kind. It doesn't announce itself. You don't wake up one morning and find yourself repaired. You wake up and find that yesterday you could stand for 20 seconds, and today you can stand for 25. You find that the photograph on the shelf still makes your chest ache, but it no longer closes your throat. You find that Jia is still everywhere, in the piano in the living room, in the bay outside the window, in the laugh you thought you heard in a coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon. But she is there the way people who truly loved us are meant to be there. Not as punishment, as presence. Hyunwoo stood for a full minute on a Tuesday in March. He walked 3 steps on a Friday. He walked to the end of the hallway on a Monday. Unassisted, his cane in his right hand, his legs shaking but holding, and stood at the window and looked out at the city that had continued without him. It was still there. He was still here. The realization was quieter than he'd expected. Not triumphant, not cinematic, just real, the way the most important things tend to be. He called his mother first. She cried, which she would deny for the rest of her life. He called his legal team second about Jia's foundation, named it after her. The Jia Kong Foundation for Young Musicians. The first cohort of scholarship recipients would be announced in the spring. He wanted them to be able to hear about it from him directly. He did not tell Zola any of this yet. He was building towards something, and he needed to build it right. The final scene happened on a Sunday. Spring had arrived in San Francisco, which meant the fog came later, and the light, when it arrived, was the kind of thing worth standing in. The mansion was different now, not redecorated, not dramatically changed, but different in the small, quiet ways that warmth gets into a space when warmth is allowed in. Plants on the terrace, music from the living room most evenings, Jia's piano polished, cared for, occasionally played by the teacher Hyunwoo had hired to keep it in condition. For when someone wants to learn, he told the agency, without specifying who he meant. Zola was on the terrace. She just ended a call with Temi, who had been accepted that very week to the architecture program at UC Berkeley. The notification had arrived while Zola was in the middle of making breakfast, and she had, to her own complete surprise, burst into tears while simultaneously laughing at herself for bursting into tears, which was the most Zola thing she had ever done. Hyunwoo had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched, said nothing, smiled in that private way he had, the one she wasn't supposed to see. Now she was on the terrace, phone away, a cup of tea in both hands, looking out at the bay. The morning light was the color of something almost happy. She was wearing yellow, a color she rarely wore. And the light was doing something to her that Hyunwoo had long since stopped pretending not to notice. She heard the door behind her. She turned and stopped. Kang Hyunwoo was walking toward her. Not in the wheelchair, not with Dr. Lim, not with anyone. Walking. His cane was in his right hand. He needed it still, would need it for some time yet, and that was all right. That was more than all right. And his steps were slow and deliberate and slightly uneven. And they were the most extraordinary things she had ever seen in her life, because she had watched this man choose not to try for weeks before he finally chose to. She understood what every single one of these steps cost him. She had been in the room for some of the falls. She knew the price. She set the tea down. Her hand went to her mouth. He kept walking. Toward her. He stopped when he was close. Close enough that the space between them was a choice and not a distance. His eyes on her. Not the city, not the bridge, not the horizon. Her. You walked, she said. Barely a whisper. I've been practicing, he said. I wanted a breath. I wanted to be standing. When I did this, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. She saw the box before he opened it. Small. Dark. The kind of box that has weight. He didn't go to one knee. He couldn't. Not yet. Not safely. And they both knew it, and it didn't matter. Because what he did instead was more honest than any practice gesture could have been. He stood in front of her. Slightly unsteady, imperfect, exactly as he was. A man still healing. A man who had chosen every single morning for months to keep going. And he opened the box. A ring. A deep gold band with a single dark stone, the color of midnight, the color of the bay at dusk, chosen with the specific care of a man who had thought at length about the woman he was choosing. He looked at her. You gave me a reason to live, he said. His voice was low and steady and entirely without performance. You didn't do it by feeling sorry for me. You didn't do it by being gentle with me when gentle was easier. You did it by being so entirely, stubbornly, unapologetically yourself that I didn't have a choice but to start being myself again. She was crying. She hadn't decided to cry. It had simply happened. The way things happen when something you've been protecting yourself against finally gets all the way through. Zola. He said her name the way he'd learned to say it. Careful, deliberate, like a word worth the full weight of pronouncing it correctly. I want a lifetime with you, not because you saved me, a breath, but because you made me want to be someone worth saving. Silence. The bay. The light. The bridge in the distance. The city below them, unhurried and enormous, and entirely, unapologetically alive. She looked at him for a long moment. At the ring. At his face. At his legs, holding him up with that particular steadiness that she knew was not strength alone, but will, the daily, deliberate, chosen kind. Then she stepped forward, closed the space, said yes. He exhaled, a long, shaking breath that carried everything inside it, and slid the ring onto her finger and straightened and pulled her into him. She came, her forehead to his arms around her, both of them standing on that terrace in the morning light. He held her there. The city moved below them. The bay reflected the sky. Somewhere inside the mansion, the piano was waiting. He was standing. He was here. He was choosing. With every breath, with every held step, with every second of this morning, to be here. And in the quiet of that moment, just before the city sounds rose up to meet the new day, a voice, soft, certain. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is decide to stay. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the person who helps you stay is the one you choose to stay for. Love doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it looks like a woman cleaning up broken glass without flinching. A man asking, barely above a whisper, for someone to stay a little longer. A first step taken not because you're ready, but because someone made you want to be. Sometimes love doesn't just heal you, it teaches you how to live again. If you enjoyed this story, kindly hit the like button. Tell me which part got you really good. And don't forget to subscribe, because more is coming. See you tomorrow.